5-minute presentation.
So let's see.
Hey, you're supposed to have about 2 to 5 minutes per slide, give or take.
Mm-hmm.
I've got one. So I got to go through these quick. There's just no way I can cut it down. It's the problem.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to share. Let me make sure that it is sharing these. Maybe. Oh yeah, share the desktop. Okay, I did it right.
you have Teams on your phone.
I do. I actually should probably do that just to make sure.
Yeah. Okay. Now, can people ask questions?
Yeah, I have the. This is the confusing part. So when I go to present, it's it completely. Alt tab. It doesn't show what is actually being. But yeah, I mean, you can leave it like this and then share a desktop. If I just share the slideshow.
Would it work better if we slid the slideshow over to start it?
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I don't have an issue. It's just you were getting to the point where you were about to bump into me with breasts, and I'm like, yeah, let me just slide out just so you don't get uncomfortable. I'm like.
Why? This.
Yeah, we got 3 minutes.
Should be fine.
And
We'll
whatever
see.
works for you. I mean,
We'll see. I'm trying to see if I can. I bet I have the link. I just want to make sure that it's right. had a list of all of them.
Okay. Supposedly questions will pop up on the little slideshow.
It should be on the left on the chat side.
Okay. Did it show people that have shown up or not?
It should.
Okay. Let's see. And it is now 12 officially. Okay. Okay, quick check to see if anybody's out there and see if anybody can hear me. Make sure we've got our technical stuff going on.
Oh. No, what is...
Okay, not getting any responses.
What is your email address?
All right, let's see.
Okay. So I am actually coming.
Okay.
And talk to her and see okay? Thanks. Bye. Is anybody on?
It doesn't seem to be.
Lady just called for the link, and I wonder if...
Okay, something's happening. Okay, we got at least one on. Okay, all right. Looks like we're starting to get some people in.
Yay!
Okay, so if one of y'all could just respond to that so I can at least get some good info. Okay, we can see the slide and we're starting to get. Okay. It looks like everybody's starting to join in. We'll give it another, probably another 2 minutes just to give it a few seconds to make sure everybody's coming in, and then we'll start the presentation. So.
Yay, people.
Yep, and it is showing properly.
Okay.
So, nice thing about checking with people. So.
Yeah.
Okay, how do
Let
I?
me see.
I'll let you.
What?
Which one do I use to?
I just need to. Okay.
I want to hide all. Yeah.
Yeah. Share conversation.
And mute everybody and. No, there's a way to.
Turn off all incoming video.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Now, I just need to figure out how to mute everyone.
Okay.
I think everyone else is muted.
Yep.
You would think they would make that easier.
Yeah. Yeah. It is supposed to be a meeting thing, so you know.
All right.
Okay. Looks like we've got some on, so we'll go ahead and get started here. I guess.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is John Guide. I'm a master gardener. Been a master gardener for about 7 years. As you can see by the slide, I am now out of Abilene, but I was trained here in Midland and lived here for quite a few years to practice all of my composting exercises in the desert. We're going to go ahead and get started because I've got a lot of information to give to y'all and not a lot of time. So if you have any questions, please wait about a slide because a lot of times questions will pop up and the next slide will take care of the questions. But if you do have questions, go ahead and feel free to type them into the chat. So, okay, here we go. All right. Okay. What we're going to be covering today is composting, the science of it, the little bit that is considered art for the composting, and kind of a little bit of everything that we need to know about making a compost pile and what we can do with it once we get done. And this will include a little bit of what we need to put into it, what we can't put into it, the composting locations, which actually becomes important, especially if you're doing things, some of the stuff that you actually might want to put into it. We are going to be discussing the hot composting method. We will not be discussing the cold, except very briefly. And then we're going to discuss, how to amend your soil with compost and compost tea, and then the particulars that we're going to need to get to specifically with composting in the desert. Because, yes, we do live in a desert. We live in that nice dark brown area that says that we get less than 15 inches of rain. That is not quite enough to consider us a full desert, but it's close enough. The other thing you want to note off of the screen is the upper left corner, up in Oregon and Washington, you'll see that nice, pretty, bright green section. And then over in the Northeast and the East Coast, you'll see, not quite as dark green, but a fair amount of green. Those are areas that get 40 to 80 inches of rainfall a year. So they are way different than us. Unfortunately, the problem is that most of the authors that write books about composting seem to live in those areas. Because of that, they have no clue what it's like to have 8% humidity and 30 miles an hour winds blowing across your compost pile. With that, it becomes a lot more different than when you're having to worry about managing how wet your compost pile gets. The other problem that a lot of the authors and a lot of the information that you get online has is that they really don't distinguish between the hot and the cold composting methods, which are they're similar, but they have a couple of differences that ends up causing a lot of confusion about how you need to organize things, whether or not you need to turn it, that sort of stuff. And if you go to YouTube and you see a video, and you read through all the different comments and stuff, you'll get some pretty good arguments discussing a lot of these different issues here. Whether or not your compost needs to be turned, how hot it should be getting, whether it's going to stink, do you have to add anything to it, and all that sort of stuff. And that's because a lot of times the composting is done by a lot of people, so there's a lot of anecdotal information out there, and not a lot of it is based on the science. What I will be teaching you today is the science that is home composting. But there is a bit of an art to it. Like I said, if you practice composting in the Northeast or the Northwest where it's real wet, the art that we work through here doesn't quite apply. It's still the science underneath. It's just trying to manage the moisture levels a lot of times. It is an experimental process. You really need to do it to really learn how to do it well. Our end result is to produce what's called humus, what most of us will consider soil. A really good, healthy looking soil is what we're looking for. There are a lot of benefits to home composting. The main thing is that it recycles all of our organic material on site. This can include all of our yard waste, all of our kitchen scraps, and various paper products, that sort of stuff. And what it does is it naturally recycles all of the plant materials from that organic material back into the soil. Now, Midland and Odessa soil sucks, plain and simple. There's no other way to describe it. It's a very high pH soil, usually between 8 and 8.5 on the pH scale, with 7 being the neutral level. So it's very, very basic, and it's very hard to grow in. The other problem is that a lot of it is sandy, and so it doesn't really retain moisture. Compost really solves those two problems. It decreases your amount of water usage while you're dealing with this, because it can retain a lot of that moisture, and it is effectively a fertilizer. It is a very weak fertilizer, but it is a very good fertilizer. It would fall under about a 1:1:2 fertilizer ratio. Most of the more industrialized fertilizers, the non-organics will run like a 10-10-10 fertilizer if you buy it from the store. So for every inch of compost you put down, you're getting about 1/10 of what you would for a normal fertilizer. So it's weak, but it is still very good for you. It also does produce a lot of mental and physical satisfaction, because turning a compost pile is kind of fun and produces a lot of exercise for you. This is the other problem that we are running into. About 2/3 of what we throw into the landfill in the way of yard trimmings, food byproducts, and paper waste can actually be composted. People think, oh, it's not a big deal. Well, the problem is that land around here is running about $30,000 an acre, give or take. So if we run out of a landfill space and we have to go build a new landfill, that's going to be really expensive for us to do. And guess who's going to be hit with that in the wallet? It's all of us taxpayers. So it's something to think about. If we can reduce the amount of junk going into the landfill just through composting, we can go ahead and save ourselves some money in the long term. So it's kind of a useful thing. Some of the benefits of the compost in our soils around here, it definitely improves water retention, especially in long drought periods, especially if the ground's been mulched on top of a composted soil. It does return the nutrients back into the soil instead of letting them blow around, which is one of the big problems we have out here. It really adds food for all of the beneficial organisms that are in the soil. This will include anything from worms to bacteria, just to feed them, which then in turn, those feed our plants that we have in our landscape, which is very useful. And then it does improve that what's called the particle aggregation in the soil, builds it up so that it doesn't compact quite so well, makes it a nice fluffy soil. Composting is nothing really except the intentional organization of organic material so that we can help it decompose into that good humus that we're looking for. This is normal plant nutrient recycling that we get from in nature. Tree will grow, drop the leaves, birds will be sitting in the trees, defecate out onto the soil. All of that lands on the surface of the ground. Normally water and will help pound that into the ground and help it start decompose right on the surface. Worms will come up and pull stuff into the soil. Beetles and other insects will help decompose it. And all of that gets washed down into the soil, which will feed the tree. The tree will then grow a new set of leaves, dump everything back out, and the cycle repeats. Problem around here that we have is that, especially in spring, the wind blows all of the leaves and stuff off the surface, and we don't get that good decomposition into the soil. So this is very beneficial, especially for our trees. For those of you that are very ecologically inclined, one of the best carbon sequestration methods, and especially the cheapest, is through composting, because all of this organic material with all the carbon in it gets built into the soil and is locked into the soil for decades, if not centuries. So it's a very good way of sequestering carbon if you're into that sort of thing. Organic materials, pretty much anything that was once alive, and I will put this minor stipulation on it of alive recently. Oil does qualify as having once been alive, but is not really considered something useful for this process. But if it's a plant or animal, it will decompose as long as the conditions are right. And we're trying to get the conditions very good so that everything can decompose where we want it to make the compost. A lot of times, like I said, the dead organic material in the form of leaves and stuff will drop onto the ground. Problem is there's not enough moisture for it to start to decay. It desiccates more than decomposes. And so we don't really get the benefit of that decomposition in our soils. The one thing we're looking for is what's called aerobic decomposition. Aerobic decomposition is decomposition with oxygen. Anaerobic decomposition does take place. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The only problem with it is that it usually stinks very badly, because one of the byproducts of it is hydrogen sulfide, which is that rotten egg smell that you get in decomposing material. Finished compost itself has a lot of soluble nutrients in it, but it also has a lot of microbes and bacteria, both alive, dead, and dormant. And that leads to a couple precautions that we do need to take when handling compost. know when you've had your last tetanus shot in case you need it. There is the occasional cuts and wounds that you'll get while turning your compost, and then pouring all that bacteria into your skin is usually not a good thing to have happen. So if you've got any cuts or wounds, make sure those are covered pretty tightly. Wear gloves, which helps a lot. If you're going to be turning your compost pile, usually want to sprinkle it on top ahead of time, because it has a tendency to get real dusty on the top, and that can spread, especially mold and bacteria into your lungs, which you really don't want it to have. One thing I would suggest, if you do have a mold allergy, such as me, I'm also asthmatic, I wear a high quality respirator mask, something you see like from a painter, because that really locks in, prevents any of the mold from getting into my system and setting off my asthma. When you're done working in your compost pile, you're going to want to scrub your hands, soap and water. We've all learned in the last year how to wash our hands properly again. So that's something to think about when you come in from the garden. The other thing that you want to think about is if you're using compost in your vegetable gardens, you want to wash your produce, especially root crops. You're going to want to scrub those pretty thoroughly with soap and water. Anything that just sits on the surface of the ground when it's growing, you probably want to go ahead and wash that off too. Stuff that's sitting up higher in, like tomatoes that are, above the soil, not necessarily as much of a problem, but anything that might contact the soil, you're going to want to go ahead and wash that before you eat it. When we're talking about organic material, it's usually broken into two basic components, browns and greens. Brown material has a lot of carbon in it. It's often what's called hydrophobic, which means it repels water. So when you're trying to get a compost pile wet, that's one of the big problems is, getting all of the brown material wet and soggy. They will compost on their own if they're wet, but it just takes a very long time to do. So we add greens. Greens have a much higher percentage of them that is nitrogen. That nitrogen acts as a protein for the cell wall formation, which allows for a higher reproduction of the bacteria that's going to do all the decomposition. And so it very greatly speeds up the decomposition of our organic material. When we're adding browns and greens to our compost pile, we're looking for about 2 parts brown to 1 part green. That's by weight. If we do that, it will give us a carbon and nitrogen ratio of about 30 to 1, which is about what we're looking for. We'll discuss that a little bit more later, and how to get that. That website right there, the NewMexicoComposters.org, that is the New Mexico version of Texas A&M. That is their composting site. They have a lot of really good information on composting in the dry climates like we run into. The other thing it has is it's got an Excel spreadsheet. So if you're trying to add something kind of odd, like say sawdust or say an organic material that's, maybe a fertilizer, a direct fertilizer or something like that, something that's on one end or the other of the spectrum of carbon or nitrogen base, it will allow you to mix up a reasonably decent mix to get a 30 to 1. They've got all sorts of neat, not only things you can add, but also what side of, what is it? Whether it's a bag of stuff or wheelbarrow of stuff, bales of straw, it's got all sorts of different measurements that you can use to build up the compost mix. Okay. Now, when we're talking about browns and greens, what does each one consist of? The browns are usually dried plant material a lot of times, your yard trimmings, that sort of stuff. Pine needles, straw, nutshells a lot of times work real well. One of the best uses for junk mail that I've ever found is I'll peel the little plastic windows out of them, run them through a shredder and throw them in a bag and wait for my compost pile to be ready for them. You turn junk mail into compost. You can't ask for anything better than that, in my opinion. Um, Other things that you can add that are browns, dryer lint, vacuum cleaner bags, that sort of stuff. Now, when we're talking dryer lint, that next line is important. We're looking at natural textiles, cotton, wool, silk, that sort of stuff. If you're dealing with a dryer lint coming off of like a 50-50 cotton polyester blend, just remember a lot of that lint is actually going to be plastic that's going to be, whether or not you want to put that in your compost pile, that's up to you. That plastic does not decompose. It breaks down to smaller and smaller bits, but it's still there as plastic. It doesn't actually decompose into anything else. Wood products, when we're talking wood products, we want to make sure that they are untreated. So no pressure treated lumber, unfortunately. Some of the stuff in there is pretty nasty, especially the arsenic that they use and the copper. Um, the other thing to think about is charcoal. The match-like charcoals you don't really want to put in there because that's adding petroleum products into your compost pile. Greens, on the other hand, are pretty much the same stuff except in a more living version of it. So if you have fresh yard trimmings, that works real well. Weeds without the seeds. This is one of the big problems with Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass, when you first mow it, it's nice. It's considered a nice, good green to add into your soil or into your compost pile. The problem is if you get the weed seeds from the Bermuda grass, which is a weed, it will take root very heavily in your compost pile, and it is very hard to get out. It just seems to you never seem to get all of it out. That's one of the big problems with that. All your kitchen scraps work real well for green additions. Coffee grounds are very good, so are tea. And the tea bags. Now, remember, I was talking about the tetanus shot. You can throw your tea bag straight into the compost pile with the little staple if you want. The staple will decompose, but sometimes you'll still get little slivers of metal in there, which can cause problems with your tetanus shots. So that's something to think about. The coffee grounds, most of the major chains are their official store policy is they save coffee grounds for people to compost. The problem is around Midland, I have yet to find any that actually do it. I have been to the Starbucks up on Loop 250 in Midland. They usually don't do it, but if I'm there and I have a tendency to go there and read for a couple hours at the Starbucks, I'll tell them to save the coffee grounds and I'll pick them up at the end of the evening, and that's what I'll do. And they will do it there as long as I'm there, asking for them. Some of the other things you can do eggshells are real nice to put in. The thing about eggshells is you do need to crush them down pretty small. The smaller they are, the faster they'll break down. But that calcium from the eggshells is actually very beneficial for our soil. Hair and whiskers, if those of you with fur babies, I come out with, a couple of fur babies a week of extras. That makes wonderful additions on the green side for your compost pile. Other things to add, I'll skip the first one for a second because I got a whole lot to talk on that. Blood meal, which is an actual fertilizer you can buy from the store, that works well. Alfalfa pellets, especially if you've had like alfalfa pellets that have gone wet and then molded out, just throw those into the compost pile. That way you don't have to worry about them. Fish meal and fish emulsion work well. The one big problem with those is they do add a bit of an odor to your compost pile, which can be a bit of a problem, especially with raccoons and rats, which is something to think about. Manures are nice to add to your compost pile. A lot of them are very good. The rabbit manure itself doesn't actually need to be composted, but it can be if you wish. The big problem here is the horse manure. Pretty much what you put into the front side of a horse comes out the back side with almost no processing. And that becomes a problem. And the problem is that most people, when they feed their horse, they're feeding it hay, which is a grass. And so a lot of that is sprayed with broadleaf herbicides, specifically 2,4-D, which a couple of the basic name or the names that they're called by, the Imprellus purpureum, all those are basically 2,4-D in some form or another. That ends up in your compost pile pretty much straight out. It actually takes a couple of years to biodegrade in the environment, unless it gets heated up to 150, 160 degrees. So that herbicide will actually, if it's added onto plants, can linger in there and kill it, any plants that you have growing in that compost pile, which is not a good thing. Like I said, the New Mexico Composters.org website has some information. It's under what's called persistent herbicides, or persistent herbicides is what it's the tag's under, and it goes into some really good information on that. That's something to think about if your friend goes, "Oh, I've got all the horse manure you want." Yeah, no, don't. It's great, but don't take it unless he's feeding an organic compost or an organic hay to his horse. That's the big thing. Other things to avoid adding into your compost pile is diseased plants and weeds with seeds. The big one here is tomato plants. Most tomato plants end up with a wilt of some sort by the end of the season. So you want to go ahead and make sure that you don't add those into your actual compost pile. You're going to want to actually toss those into the trash. Weeds, like I said, you're not going to want to add weeds into your compost pile because they love growing in compost. Wood ash you can add, but I would do it in very small amounts. It's better to just add that into your garden later if you need to add some potassium into your soil. The fish, the meat, and the dairy, if you add them into your pile, remember that they rot as fast as they decompose, so they will let off odors, which is the big problem in adding them to the pile. That will attract rats, raccoons, skunks, cats, dogs, everything to your compost pile, which is why you usually don't want to add them. The oils, the butters, the margarine, that sort of stuff doesn't really break down very well. The key thing on that is that the insects actually eat that and process it for you, and then the waste from the insects is actually what decomposes. So you usually don't want to add those to your pile except in very small amounts, and also because those go rancid before they can actually get processed through. Other things to think about not adding, things like any non-organics, any of the chemically treated wood or charcoal products, any of the sides, that's herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, vermicides, which is designed to kill worms. When we're talking manures like we did with the horse manure, the other thing to think about is sheep manure. Sheep manure is very high in vermicides usually because sheep are notoriously wormed on a very regular basis. Dog, cat, and pig manure are usually suggested that you don't add those. And the main reason for that is because the dog and cat manure and pig manure, they're close enough to human anatomy that there is a slight chance, very slight chance, of diseases transferring between them and into the compost pile, which is something you probably don't want to do. Now, if you want to have a separate compost pile that is strictly for non-edible plants, say your garden plants that are all just your roses and that sort of stuff, you could build a separate compost pile, but just make sure you don't mix those in with anything that you're doing for vegetables or anything you might eat later. The glossy colored paper and the waxed paper, the main problem with those is that they don't absorb any moisture, and so they don't break down, and so that can be a problem. The compost process is pretty much run through a whole bunch of interdependent variables. Around here, the hardest one for us to control is moisture. We're looking for about 50% moisture when we're going through this. This is about what wet coffee grounds is looking like. That's what we're trying to get to. Wet but not dripping wet. During the summer, it'll compost a little faster. During the winter, it's a little slower because the outside ambient temperatures don't allow the pile to get quite so hot. We're looking for aeration throughout the pile to help speed up the process. The more oxygen it is, it's kind of like a fire. More oxygen, the faster it'll decompose. Um, Time, if you're doing a cold compost pile, it goes slower. The hotter the compost pile, the faster it'll decompose. Ingredient size, like I said, shred the paper before you throw it in the pile, makes things go a lot quicker. Your brown to green mix makes a difference. That 30-to-1 is what we're looking for. If it's, closer to a 60 or 80-to-1 browns, carbon ratio, it'll decompose slower. If there's a lot more greens, it will decompose faster, but it also has a tendency to run into spots where it will smell because of it's a little bit too hot. Insects can be beneficial to your compost pile. The little pill bugs or the roly-polies that you see in the screen there are very useful. Beetles are very useful for decomposition. They like taking all that decomposing material and breaking it down for you. The other things that for insects that like your compost pile are ones that you don't really want around your house. Those will be the roaches, the termites, and the ants. All of those enjoy breaking down your compost. So you usually want to make sure that your compost pile is not up next to your house, because you don't want to get those insects will attracted to your home. Worms work very well for composting. You can actually do composting strictly with worms if you want. That's a whole nother lecture. The worms that you do want to do for your compost are actually what's called red wigglers. They're short, fat, and red, as opposed to the standard earthworms, which are kind of a brown, a long and thin type of worm. So you can get the red wigglers pretty much the same places you can get bait, the regular earthworms, without any problem. Just add them into your compost pile and they'll work through. The one problem with worms in a hot compost pile, it actually gets too hot for the worms to be in and can kill them if you aren't careful. They'll kind of sit around on the outside of your compost pile and work on that while the inside gets really nice and hot. When we're building up our compost pile, we're going to do what's called adding bulking material, which I'll talk about on the next slide. We'll add a layer of the bulking material at the bottom and then start adding our browns and greens, usually in layers, just because we've got a bag of brown stuff and a bag of greens at a time. Want to make sure that your layers are reasonably thin, talking 2 to 3 inches at a time, so that there's a good chance that those will get mixed together. About every 6 to 12 inches, we're going to add another layer of the bulking material, which we'll talk about, just to make sure that we've got some airspace in there. Once we get to the top of the compost pile, we're usually going to want to add things like wood chips or shredded paper. Actually works very well also. Once you get shredded paper wet, it has a tendency to form like a solid cap across the top of your compost pile, which works well to keep the moisture into the pile. And then usually we're going to want to put a tarp over it. This will help prevent things like flies and that sort of stuff from coming in and digging into your pile. Also, it will help prevent too much dehydration on the pile. Coarse bulking material is pretty much sticks, twigs, that sort of stuff. And we're talking larger ones, so 1/2 inch up to a couple of inches around. The idea is that they don't squish down together very tightly, so that they have a lot of air. They form little air voids everywhere. And so that way, since we don't have that air blowing through the compost pile because we're trying to seal it up, we have to store the oxygen pretty much in the pile between turnings. Pine cones, if you've got a couple of pine trees around your yard, you probably have plenty of pine cones. Those are some of the best bulking materials you can find because it's got a lot of open space to it and they decompose rather nicely, actually. So the two choices of composting, I said we've got the hot method and the cold method. Everything I've talked about up to this point will work both for the hot and the cold methods. The only real difference is that with the hot method, we're trying to create heat to heat up the pile and make it decompose faster. We do this by adding labor into it in the form of turning the compost pile to re-aerate it every once in a while. The cold compost method, a lot of times it's a lot easier because you can just kind of let it sit there and compost on its own. We don't turn it. We're not trying to create heat, but it can create heat if we, build it as a big pile all at once. There's a lot of little different techniques that we can do in cold composting, lasagna gardening and pit methods and all sorts of different things. But that's a whole another discussion on its own. Nature does cold composting pretty much all the time in forests. That's, decomposition in form with moisture. It's, how Mother Nature's always done it. So the problem is that the cold method can take as long as 2 years to finish up, and that's usually a lot longer than most people are willing to wait. So our hot composting, we're looking at intentionally creating heat to help speed up the process. To do that, we usually build everything in a single batch at a time, as opposed to just adding to the pile slowly over time. Now we can build up a pile slowly over time, and leave it dry. It won't decompose, and then try and get it wet later. But remember that those brown materials have a hard time absorbing moisture, and so it's a little harder to do it, to build up a pile slowly at a time, and then do a hot composting method. Minimum size when we're talking hot composting is about 3 by 3 by 3, a cubic yard at a time. Up to, I list 5 by 5 by whatever you want. The main reason for this, 5 by 5 by 5, is the largest I've done. And the reason I put that as an upper limit is a cubic yard of material weighs about 1,200 pounds. So it's a lot of material to turn. When you're talking a 5 by 5 by 5 pile, you're talking about 5 cubic yards of material. So 6,000 pounds of dirt you're trying to turn over. Unless you're using mechanical means, a tractor or something like that, that's usually more effort than anybody is willing to put into it. And I'm an avid composter, and that's more than I want to try. So that's something to think about. Now, the main reason that we're trying to get a minimum pile size is that large mass of material helps insulate some of the heat that's generated by the pile in the middle. The outside edges of the pile don't tend to decompose and turn that pile. We take the outside edges, which haven't decomposed, turn them into the middle, and let them decompose. In the process of that turning, we're adding oxygen back. We're also usually adding moisture to that pile to make sure that it's maintaining that 50% moisture levels, which is what we're looking at doing. To do this, we need to process it through, and flip it about every week or two. You can do it more often if you want. I've seen videos, talking about 18-day compost, but I don't know of many people that have that much time and energy on their hands. It involves pretty much turning your compost about every third day. As soon as you start seeing the temperature drop in your compost pile, they're recommending turning it. It's just a lot of effort, but you do get results rather quickly. So what we're doing though, when we're hot composting, as those microorganisms reproduce, they'll burn up they'll break the enzyme, or they'll create the enzymes that break the carbohydrate bonds on the brown materials that were built in the pile. That releases heat. That heat allows them to reproduce faster up to a certain point. Temperatures, you can see, 100 degrees on your pile will not be uncommon in winters. In summers, a lot of times you'll see them up to 150 without too much problem. If you're getting over about 140 degrees in your compost pile, it will destroy the seeds and the pathogens. The problem is you got to maintain that temperature for at least 24 hours throughout the entire pile if you really want to guarantee destruction of the weed seeds and pathogens. So it's kind of hard to do that, but it can do it if you really want to try. Um, Hot composting will take 3 to 6 months, usually closer to 3 if you're pretty adamant about turning the pile. We usually organize it in 2 bins or 3 bins just because it's easy to take a pile from one bin and turn it into the next bin, as opposed to trying to return it back into the same bin itself. A lot of times you'll go ahead and let it cure, what's called a cold curing phase, which is a fungal phase as opposed to a bacterial phase, which allows the compost to decompose just a little bit more. And it takes a couple of weeks to do this after it's finished getting hot. Um, Now, the one downside about the hot composting method, it can decrease the volume of the pile by as much as 1/2 if you aren't careful. If it gets hot for long enough, it will actually decrease the volume of the pile a little bit. This is a couple of pictures of some hot composting methods. The one thing that we don't like to see here in Midland is that steam coming off the pile. That's all of our moisture leaving the pile. So that's something we want to avoid. Tarps work well to cover the pile if need be. You'll see a compost thermometer there in the middle. You can pick these up pretty much any box store or garden center. Kind of help keep an eye on what temperatures are running. If you buy compost from the store, usually how that compost is actually made is through the large scale windrows that you'll see in the right picture. There are requirements by law that the compost pile must maintain 140 degrees for, I believe it's either 48 or 72 hours throughout the composting process, before they can legally sell it. Now, the problem with that is as soon as they've hit those maxes, usually most of the composters, if they're running a little behind on their composting, they'll bag that and send it off to the store to sell. The problem with that is that's not finished compost yet. It may be legal to sell, but it's not finished. If you go to buy a bag of compost and it smells, it is not finished compost, and don't buy it. Skip it and move on to try a different store that might have some that's actually finished compost. There should not be any fragrances in composting very much. There are times when you will get a little bit of smell from the hydrogen sulfide. Usually it's from getting your pile too wet at a point, or if the bulking material has broken down enough and you end up with some compacted areas where you're not getting oxygen, either through being too wet or just being compacted. So a little aeration takes care of those problems. The one thing that does smell in compost is manure if you're adding it. So just remember that. It'll go away fairly quickly because it breaks down pretty quickly to the point where you won't actually get the smells of manure. It takes 3 to 4 days usually, is from what I've found. Composting bins, this is what we're looking at here, either a 2 or 3 bin system. A lot of times, like I said, on the 3 bins, you kind of build up the pile, or into the first one, turn it into the second one as you need to, and you can go back and forth between those first 2 piles or first 2 bins. And then a lot of times you'll take that once you get it all finished, throw it into the 3rd bin, which will be your finished compost. That way you've got a nice place to store it until you need it. One of the things you noticed on those pictures that they were pretty much sealed containers. That's what we're looking for here in the desert. We're trying to decrease wind blowing through our compost pile and sucking all the moisture out. What we're going to do is add that bulking material at the bottom, add all of our material in, adding bulking material throughout as needed, and then covering the pile once we get finished with that. Now, one of the things about compost pile, they don't have to be pretty. They don't have to be in a bin. You can do them simply by just doing it as a pile on the ground, but it does make it a little bit nicer and neater if you do it in a bin itself, which is kind of nice. One thing you're going to think about building your bins, you want to make sure that they're easy to add to, harvest from, and to turn, which can be a bit of an issue when you're talking about a 3-foot tall pile. You want to be able to seal off the moisture Oh, yes, it's unmuted here. There we go. And then make sure we can manage that airflow coming through, and also we want to try and decrease any animals or flying insects getting into the pile. Animals will include anything from the rats, raccoons, skunks, that sort of stuff, to larger ones like dogs too. Okay. All right. Bins, these are some of the ones you can buy commercially. Uh, they work. The one big problem is they've got way too many holes for what we're looking for. Duct tape will take care of that problem. Um, let's see, what do we got here? And this is my personal compost pile that I do. If you notice, I've got a tarp over it. I use cinder blocks. Cinder blocks work very well for a compost pile. They're easy to stack up to however big you need it to be. As you can see, my compost pile is burning at about 140 degrees, which is a nice, good temperature for it. Helping kill off all those pathogens. And then a shot there of the compost pile while it's still in the process of decomposing. As you notice on the outside edge, it's very dry. You can see some of the shredded paper still. It's not decomposing at that top layer. Once you get into it, you can see it's starting to decompose. It's actually a little dry at this point, and I was getting ready to turn it and add some moisture because I knew it was needing it. So uh, straw bales work actually very well for using for making up a compost pile. You can pretty much build them to whatever size you need. You can use it for both the hot or the cold compost methods. The one thing about this to think about, straw bales will decompose if they're kept in contact with the moisture. Not a big deal, but just something to think about, that you will have to replace them over time. Bottom shot's actually the New Mexico Composters.org. That's their actual compost site right there that they use for community gardens. If you do a straw bale one like this, you can let your chickens do your turning for you instead of actually doing it. They actually add nitrogen in their poop when they are turning it like this. You will want to make sure that you moisten it every day, though, and probably cover it at nighttime. Otherwise, it's going to dry out very quickly. This is what's called a New Zealand box. I'm guessing it was designed in New Zealand. I don't know for sure, but these things are wonderful. Those posts on each of the corners are slotted, designed so that you can add boards to them and take the boards out very easily. This allows you to remove the board so you can add material in or pull it out. Also, for turning, it works well. As you notice, they've got lids on it that are hinged up so that you can easily open and close them and seal these boxes off nice and tight. Some other ones very similar. Notice all built out of wood. You can build it out of pressure treated lumber if you want, but understand that that's going to be in contact with some chemicals you may not want in your compost, but it does help prevent from decomposing over time. That one on the left is a 2-bin system. And like I said, you can do it with a 1-bin system. It's just a little harder when you're talking about turning your piles. You can use something like this, which is just a simple wire cage. The problem that this is, it will evaporate all the moisture out of it in about 2 hours in spring. So you usually want to do something to prevent that. Plastic will prevent that, but the problem with the plastic here is that the sunshine will decompose that or break down that plastic enough that it will be hard for it to maintain any integrity. So if you're going to do something like this, I would line it first with cardboard on the outside to shade the plastic, add the plastic next, and then build your compost pile on the inside of this. And that's, $4 or $5, and you've already built up your compost pile. It's very cheap for this, but it does work. Rollers and tumblers you can buy. I've been doing this for about 5 years, giving this talk or other talks like it. I have met one person that has enjoyed their tumbler. Like I said, it's about 1,200 pounds per cubic yard of material. So while these are designed to roll, it is very hard to roll these, even, especially if they're very moist. So this is a very nice box that's been built up. The only problem with this is the wiring on the side. We need to make sure that this box is actually sealed up a little bit on the outsides. Otherwise, it's a pretty nice little box to use. Pallets are pretty much free around the place. Not too hard to find free pallets. The only thing with this is all the slats allow a lot of airflow through. So if you put a couple layers of cardboard in all of the various slots, that would work well to help prevent some of the air flowing through, and you could get this. So this could basically be a free compost bin for you if you wanted to build one like this. Now then, we're getting on to any additions that we want to add to the compost pile. Officially, you don't have to add anything. The original rationale behind it was you're increasing that microbial load and bacterial load up front to give it a jump start. Really don't need to do that. Anything that you're adding to the pile already has all the microbes on it. You're just trying to organize it for them to get busy doing what they're supposed to be doing. Soil used to be added a lot of times. If you want, add some of your old compost that worked well. Things like the compost maker that you see in the garden stores, a lot of times that's going to have been sitting on the shelf for who knows how long. You don't really need it, so it's kind of a waste of money in my opinion. We do not need lime. Like I said, those people on the East Coast, they have a tendency to have very alkaline soil, and so they need to add lime to bring that pH up. We don't need that here with our alkaline soil, so no lime into your compost pile, please. So, quick summary of hot composting. We're trying to build them all at one time. We're trying to build that heat in the pile because it is a high energy type process. We're trying to improve that rate of decomposition through building that heat. We build them as a single unit at a time, get everything kick-started. Now, once we do that, when do we know the compost is done? Okay. First thing to even think about, is there anything left in the compost pile that looks like what it was when we started? If you're talking things like shredded paper, those decompose rather quickly, so you won't notice them. But things like chunks of wood, some rinds of, various fruit or something like that may take a little longer to decompose. So you may want to hold off on, calling it finished compost until those are done. You turn the pile and no heat's generated once the turn the pile, or very minimal heat. That's a good indication that pretty much everything that can be broken down by the bacteria pretty much is. That's good. And it'll have that good earthy fragrance when you do turn it. So those are some of the things to think about. Now, remember we added all that bulking material to the pile to help add all the oxygen into it and maintain the oxygen levels. We need to pull that out once we're trying to actually use the compost. The milk crate you see on the right there works very well for getting the bigger chunks of sticks out. And then what you see on the left is a very simple frame that is made out of 2x4s and what's called wire mesh or hardware cloth. It's 1/4-inch screen wire that works very well for sifting a lot of the medium-sized particles out and then letting all the straight humus and compost fall into your wheelbarrow so you can ship it off to where you need to. What I'd like doing with this, when you turn all of this, turn that back into your next compost pile. That way you have, if you want to add something to your compost, that's the best stuff to use, is that bulking material and leftover screenings from your compost from the last thing. Okay, when we're talking soil amendments, usually you can do a topical application like you see on the top picture there. Usually you're going to want to mulch after that, otherwise it has a tendency to dry out. You can dig it in either with a rototiller or just kind of fork it in with a garden fork. You can do what's called compost plugs or compost tea. Those are also ways of dealing with it. Thing to think about, a square foot of, or a cubic foot of compost will cover about 12 square feet to a depth of about 1 inch. If you're trying to amend garden soil, especially if it's for the first time on a garden, I'm going to recommend anywhere between 4 and 6 inches of compost into your soil tilled in, because that's about what we're going to need here with our soils. So that takes a lot of compost on a fairly short, small garden bed, but that's what we need with our soils. So, like I said, once we get done amending the soil, we're going to want to mulch it, add a little extra water to help water that into the soil a little bit also. Mulch around here, especially in around the Midland, Odessa area, is some of the best stuff you can use to actually help your soils maintain moisture and to also build soil long term. Basically, you're building a cold compost pile on top of the soil. So it's very nice. You can get free mulch both in Midland and Odessa. Both have locations that at the yard waste disposal facilities that you can pick up mulch for free, which is always nice. Talking about trees and shrubs, when you're amending soil, you dig a hole about 3 times the size of your tree or shrub, and then plant your tree in there. Do not amend the soil that you put back into the hole. Amend the top of the soil and let that compost get watered into the soil and benefit that way. So, compost plugs is basically a hole that you dig that you add the compost in. What you want to do, especially if you're doing it for trees, you want to do that at the drip line, and that will work nicely. Compost tea, basically taking like a cloth bag, adding in some compost and setting it into a bag or a bucket of water, letting it sit for 3 or 4 days, and then using that water to fertilize your plants. Works very well. It fertilizes them a little bit and adds a lot of that microbial life forms into the soil, which is always good. Quick overview, trying to manage airflow for desert composting so we don't dry out the compost too much. If you are putting a bin out, putting it in the shade is useful, especially during the hot months. The heat is useful for the compost. The problem is when you're out there trying to turn it in the middle of summer, it kind of sucks doing it in the middle of the sun. So if you can do it in the shade, it works nice. Don't forget to add the bulking material throughout. Chop up, shred, make sure your sizes of material you're adding is small. Make sure to add both the browns and the greens. Water as necessary, trying to maintain that 50% moisture. Realistically, you're probably going to want to, even if you're not turning on a regular basis, you're going to want to go out and water your pile about once a week. Otherwise, it's going to dry out too much. Don't forget to cover it with tarps or something like that to help keep the moisture in and reduce flies. All right, right at 1 o'clock, 1:02, not too bad. Okay, any questions that we have? Feel free to type them in the thing. I think we're open for a few more minutes, but that's going to be it. So, all right. And if that's it, and I don't see anybody typing in for any responses, we'll call that a day. And if you all, okay. If you all have any questions, feel free to contact the Master Gardeners. Their website's on screen right there. Oh, got one. Okay. Okay, thank you all very much, and we'll have a good day.